Good evening, everyone. My name is Leslie Cormack, and I am the Dean of the Faculty of Arts here at the University of Alberta, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this, the 11th Annual Henry Kreisel Honorary Lecture. I want to begin by respectfully acknowledging that the University of Alberta is located on Treaty 6 territory, the traditional lands of First Nations and Métis people. And then I want to welcome you to this wonderful event hosted by the Canadian Literature Centre. Because my mother went to the University of Alberta here in the 1940s, she was taught by Henry Kreisel. And so this lecture has always had a very important part in my heart as I think about the history of this great university. This event has become a flagship event for the Canadian Literature Centre, which offers many activities and speakers to the community, to communities really, throughout the year. I'm very proud of the fact that the Canadian Literature Centre is part of the Faculty of Arts, and I've been delighted to see it grow over the years. It has grown tremendously in the years that it has existed, and is now firmly established, I think, nationally and internationally, as a leading force in the support of Canadian literatures and cultures. The Faculty of Arts is committed to the support of the diversity and outstanding vitality of Canadian literature, as exemplified in the work that the CLC does each and every day, and exemplified even more in this year's guest lecturer. I want to thank Eric and Alexis Schloss, as well as Jim and Betty Edwards, for their generous founding gifts and their continued support of the Canadian Literature Centre. I also want to thank all the other donors, whether you're here in the room or in absentia, who worked to make the work of the CLC possible. And of course, I especially right now want to thank the people at the CLC who organized today's event. Dr. Daniel Laforêt, Acting Director of the CLC, and his team, Jason Purcell and Anna Chadeki. And now I'd like to call on Dr. Laforêt to offer a few words.
Good evening, bonsoir. Dr. Eric Schloss, distinguished guests, esteemed members of the Edmonton public, all of you literature lovers without the support of which none of this would be possible. I'm Daniel Laforêt, Acting Director of the CLC for the winter and the spring, and I'm very pleased to welcome you to the 11th installment of the CLC Kreisel Lecture. The lecture series was founded in 2007 to honor the memory of a foremost Canadian intellectual, the author, university professor, and officer of the Order of Canada, Henry Kreisel. He inspired generations of students to love literature and was one of the first people to incorporate the immigrant experience to modern Canadian literature. Since its inception, the Kreisel Lecture Series has become the flagship event of the CLC. Throughout the years, we've had the chance to hear some of the nation's most eloquent and popular voices. Lawrence Hill, Izzy Edoujian, Annabelle Lyon, Dany Laferrière, Margaret Atwood, among others. Our evening with Heather O'Neill tonight will be no exception, trust me. Sitting here together tonight, we're all taking part in a lively, vibrant tradition, and I want to thank you all for it. So before I leave the stage, there are a couple of things that you need to know. Every Kreisel lecture is an original text by the guest author, and they are all published by University of Alberta Press. Last year's lecture by Margaret Atwood just came out. You will be able to purchase, well, you're already able to purchase it on the book selling table provided by Audrey's Books down and during the reception afterwards, down there. Tonight's lecture by Heather O'Neill will also be available in the same published format next year. Second thing I want you to know is for those who are inclined to do so, we encourage live tweeting tonight. The hashtag is Kreisel 2017, so that's Kreisel 2017 in one word, without space. Now to offer a more formal and engaging introduction to Heather O'Neill's talk tonight, I'm pleased to welcome on stage my colleague from Montreal University in Calgary, nonfiction author and Canadian scholar extraordinaire, Mr. Kit Dobson. Thank you, sir. Welcome to the 2017 Henry Kreisel Commemorative Lecture. Thank you for being here tonight at this fantastic Tim Centre for the Arts at the University of Alberta. So my name is Kit Dobson. I'm a faculty member in English at Mount Royal University in Calgary. Thank you so much to the Canadian Literature Centre, especially Daniel Laforêt, Marie Carrière, Jason, Anna, and the folks who make this place work. It is an honor to be here and to have the privilege to introduce you to our guest speaker. When I was asked to introduce Heather O'Neill, I felt very lucky and fortunate, yet also challenged. Heather O'Neill is, on the one hand, someone who can be introduced based on her achievements. Born, raised, and resident in Montreal, she is the author of 3 jaw-droppingly good novels: Lullabies for Little Criminals, The Girl Who Was Saturday Night, and her new novel, 2017's The Lonely Hearts Hotel, as well as the short story collection Daydreams of Angels and the collection of poems Two Eyes, Are You Sleeping? Her work has won Canada Reads, the Hugh MacLennan Award, the Danuta Gleed Award, and she has been on the list for many of the top national and international literary prizes, like the Giller Prize, the Governor-General's Award, and the Impact Dublin Literary Award. The accolades are mounting, and I will wager are only going to continue with the publication of her new work. But an introduction of this sort sells Heather's achievements short, at least in my view. Heather O'Neill's writing is difficult, challenging, yet beautiful and soothing. To focus on her novels in particular might allow us to see a little bit of what I mean. Her first novel, Lullabies for Little Criminals, published in 2006, features Baby, a girl who lives in central Montreal. She spends her time wandering through the plateau, her eyes full of the wonder and curiosity that can characterize young people just coming into themselves. She is remarkably open to the world, fantastically perceptive, and as troublesome as can be. The world of wonders in which Baby lives, however, is a frightening one to read from this side of adolescence. We watch her father's battle with his addiction continue to worsen, and as no one maintains much interest in guiding Baby, the neighborhood pimp begins to take an interest. Throughout Lullabies for Little Criminals, Heather presents us with a doubled vision, that which Baby manages somehow to maintain, one that hangs on to childhood despite terrible circumstances. The other vision is that which the reader brings to the text, one that is full of concern for the wayward protagonist and wary of each of her troubling decisions. Heather's subsequent novel, The Girl Who Was Saturday Night, published in 2014, returns us to the plateau in Montreal, this time to the era of the second referendum in Quebec. Her protagonist, Nushka, and her protagonist's brother, Nicholas, are the children of a once famous, now failed and disgraced, fictional singer associated with the Quebecois nationalist movement. Nushka and Nicholas experience young lives of rash acts. They discover sex through their lives in the neighborhood, and they struggle to survive in their impoverished surroundings. At the same time as their lives are unfolding, a documentary film crew descends upon them, seeking to make a film about their dysfunctional family. Here, again, the plateau, and the Boulevard Saint-Laurent in particular, is a site of unusual assortments, of people who hang around, smoking their cigarettes in impossible weather, and who offer Nushka and Nicholas worrying openings to adulthood. The novel is brimful of a feeling of wasted decadence, of risk, and of cats. O'Neill's writing is always, it seems, full of cats and of characters who are tragically flawed, yet who are nonetheless honest and true. Her new novel also begins with Montreal, but the historical Montreal of the Depression. It stars the orphaned children, Rose and Pierrot, who, after being raised in the same orphanage, struggle to find their way in Montreal's underworld, a place populated by gangsters, their mistresses, sex workers, addicts, and clowns. As in her previous work, Heather's writing is difficult and challenging, yet beautiful and soothing. Rose and Pierrot manage to retain their whimsy and their charm despite a world that would harden them, that would harm them, and that would, at times, eliminate them entirely. The turn in this recent novel, this new novel, to a more historical focus is something that interests me greatly, but I am, above all else, deeply compelled by her characters. For it is her characters, above all, who are difficult, challenging, beautiful, and soothing. This combination is not an easy one to maintain. I find that reading Heather's work is like eating ice cream on a hot summer's day. Even if you don't want to do so, even if you wish to savor it, you have to rush. You have to go at it with gusto and abandon, lest it melt all over you. Her books read like melting ice cream. If that simile seems a bit labored,
and it probably is. That's in part because my own similes simply cannot keep up with Heather's. Heather O'Neill is, in my view, also the finest writer of the simile in contemporary literature. Similes leap from her pages, and I find myself anticipating the next like or as comparison. Many of her paragraphs build up to outrageously perfect ones. I had so many to choose from, but I will limit myself to one such example, since we are here to hear from her. Early on in her new novel, we read the following, quote, "Rose and Pierrot were orphans. There was something magical about hearing them talk about their tragic circumstances in such high-pitched voices. They were metaphors for sadness. It was like someone playing a requiem on a xylophone. It wasn't something you heard every day." That's the end of that quotation. Like someone playing a requiem on a xylophone, it's a perfect simile, but it's one that needs everything that comes before it. It needs the sweep of the narrative and of the metaphor to bring into relief the dissonant contrast between the form of the requiem and the utterly inadequate instrument of the xylophone. The clash is both funny and sad. Again and again, her paragraphs soar to the point of the simile, to the moment where everything is revealed through a comparison that forces readers to pause and to recognize precisely what a driving force is at work in this writing. For these reasons and more, I find myself thinking about Heather's writing in my own modest endeavors. Last year, I had the tremendous privilege to live in Montreal, in the heart of the plateau that Heather's work manages to describe so beautifully. I was there in part to write about that city. With my children and my partner, we spent our time gathering fragments of whimsy, which we found in every direction we turned. Learning the meaning of the word whimsy, in fact, was a very important part of our conversations with our two daughters. We watched acrobats practicing in the park. We saw unicyclists pushing forward into blizzards. We said hello to cats walking across fence tops. And we noticed a steady stream of university students in oversized sunglasses eating ice cream on the street corners. Every weekend brought a new festival, and the street art was as fantastic as the galleries, even if the roads were sometimes impassable. It is a city that Heather's writing captures magnificently, and that I enjoyed all the more for reading her works while I was there. As I cede the floor now to Heather O'Neill, I think that it is worth noticing a small but perhaps important coincidence. This year, as we've already heard, marks the 11th Kreisel commemorative lecture. The number 11 seems to be a magical number in the Lonely Hearts Hotel, popping up at important junctures. The number 11 serves as a code between Rose and Pierrot. It is their default number, and it is the age at which they both agree that they were the happiest. Perhaps this time, this 11th occasion of this lecture, may be among our happiest too. Folks, it's my pleasure to introduce Heather O'Neill.
Hi, thank you all for coming. I was born in Montreal and spent my first years in the city. When I was 5, my parents got divorced. My mom packed me up and put me in the back seat of our burgundy car. She tossed my dad's stuff out of the trunk, and we drove down to Virginia, where she was from. After 2.5 years of moving around, she told me she had changed her mind about wanting to be my mother. She basically broke up with me. She put me on a plane, and I showed up back in Montreal, where I was to spend the rest of my childhood with my father. A bit about my father. My dad was a petty criminal as a child. He worked sneaking into windows for older, hardened criminals. He was in prison when he was 11 years old. As an adult, he worked as a janitor, but he saw himself as street smart. He had a little silver transistor radio that he attached to his belt. This kept him abreast of the news. He listened to it so often that he assumed he was as intelligent as the most intelligent people were. My dad was determined to take care of me properly. He made me pancakes and cookies and sewed my clothes properly. He was actually really good at that. What he was a little worse at was what he regarded as an integral part of parenting, the dispensing of life advice. But nonetheless, it was one of his favorite things to do. He liked spending time with me because I had to look up to him. I was only 7. He treated me as though I was his junior partner. He had several rules he was adamant about. 1, never keep a diary. The thing was that I couldn't not keep a diary. I had been given a journal when I was 8 years old by an uncle. I loved the feeling of chronicling my daily events in the black journal. I quite liked books of all types, but here was a book that had empty pages. It was waiting for me to put words down on it. It made the events of the day seem important and worthy of a novel. But my dad was insistent I knock it off. He told me it was a terrible habit because everything that one wrote in a diary was ultimately used against a person in court. He seemed to think this was an inevitable life event. But I wonder whether he felt exposed. I wonder if he felt as though he were under surveillance, as though I would be able to return to these as an adult and then judge what he had done in his behavior rather than my own, for as a child I was always innocent. But no matter how many journals he threw out, I would continue to write in them. I'm writing in one now. He was also always redacting my letters to my grandmother, wiping out lines with a big black marker and then making me rewrite it at the end. Lesson number 2, learn to play the tuba. My dad was insistent that when I got to high school, I play the tuba. My dad said that the world didn't have enough tuba players, so there would always be a shortage of them, and you could always get a job if you played the tuba. I was very worried about being able to earn a living, so if I was just allowed to play the tuba in music class, my problems would already be over when I was 11. There were girls in my class that told me I was too skinny to play the tuba and that it was always given to the fattest kid. But I was sure that I could hold it. I thought that it would be like having a baby elephant in my lap all the time, and that seemed like such a good thing. I looked at the tuba with such longing and desire, as though it were a fat millionaire in a tailored suit who could have taken care of me for the rest of my life. But there was only one tuba, and it was given to a really big boy. Instead, I was given a trumpet. I always wept playing the trumpet for the first 3 months. The teacher said that there was a peculiar sadness to the way I played. I earned an A in music class, although I never believed I deserved it. Lesson number 3, make friends with Jewish kids. Another of my dad's commandments was that I hang out and pay attention to what the Jewish kids were up to. He grew up in a working-class neighborhood that was filled with French Canadians and Jewish kids. The Jews had lived in apartments next to him. They had come out to play with him in their pea caps and dirty undershirts. They had swam in the river and cursed and laughed together. The Jewish kids all went to high school and university. They had all left the neighborhood and did interesting things with themselves. The Jews who had grown up during the Depression in Montreal were a marvelous and magically upwardly mobile class. While the Jewish kids he grew up with were now running their own companies and factories, he was pretty much where he started off. They had somehow got ahead of him, so he was adamant that I always do what the Jewish kids were doing. They were on their way to great places. I had a very good friend named Malachi when I was 9. He wore Adidas shorts and gym socks up to his knees. He bought a walkie-talkie and would stay up late chatting with truck drivers. They would have a lot of time on their hands. He was saving all his paper route money because he wanted to go to therapy. He quite liked the idea of it. He asked his parents, and they said no way, they weren't paying for it because there was nothing wrong with him. We spent a lot of time sitting at the bottom of the swimming pool wearing goggles and looking at each other. I'm not exactly sure what I learned about success from hanging out with my Jewish friends, but they were some of the most wonderful pals I ever had. Lesson 4, accept that you're ugly and move on. My dad said when I was a baby I was so ugly that he was afraid to look at me. He would close his eyes and say, no, she couldn't have been that ugly. But then, when he opened them again, there I was, even uglier than he remembered. He said my eyes looked like they were jumping out of my skull, and he was so embarrassed at the hospital when I was born. When he rode the bus home with me in his arms, he put a blanket over my head so as not to shock the other passengers. He said that when I cried as a child, the most frightening howl came out of my mouth. Once there was an alley cat on the fire escape trying to get in the window, having mistaken me for one of its own. He had to throw a glass of water at it to make it leave. Sometimes I like to imagine that cat with a paw filled with flowers and bow tie on its neck knocking on the window looking for me. As a child, he also told me he was afraid to open the window because a wind would blow in and pick me up and carry me away because my ears were so large. He told me once I really didn't need to take the school bus. All I had to do was hold my hair in a ponytail, and I could use my ears to fly to school like Dumbo. He called me Chicken Legs as an affectionate nickname because he said I was so skinny. I grew up thinking I was but ugly, but it was kind of nice thinking I was ugly. It made me feel I had to work on other attributes. It took the pressure off of ever even bothering to try to look good. Otherwise, little girls are bombarded with praise for superficial qualities, informed from the time they can understand a sentence what the male gaze thinks of them. And I liked the idea of being unique, and if I could be the ugliest baby in the whole city, then that seemed like an accomplishment. Number 5, never tell anyone what you do for a living. My father told me I should never tell anyone what my parents did for a living, for God's sakes. He said it was no one's business to begin with, and he said they would judge me and never give me any opportunities in life. On my birth registry, under occupation, my father wrote that he was a professor of philosophy. Now, my father dropped out of school in grade 3, and his reading skills were rather limited. He always got me to read everything that came in the mail out loud to him, so it might seem an outrageous lie to claim he was a professor of philosophy. But the lie to me wasn't completely out of left field. He did tend to pontificate, and his friends did listen to what he said, and to contemplate his conclusions and assumptions. I think that lying is just a way of telling the truth in a metaphorical way. In elementary school, I always had to fill out the form with parental information. He told me to tell the teacher he was a spy, and therefore all the required information was classified. The gym teacher asked me if it was true that my father was a spy. I looked down at my burgundy Adidas running shoes and gave my rote response, "I'm not at liberty to say." When I enrolled in high school, he listed his profession as sculptor. Well, that year he had a job as a janitor for a building, and the fence around the building came down. So he'd been collecting broken hockey sticks outside the skating rink for years. He sawed off the blades of hockey sticks and drilled them together and made this very strange fence out of them. Everyone stopped and stared at his construction. He had probably lowered the property value by about $100,000 in one morning, but occasionally one of the viewers would exclaim that this was quite marvelous, a true objet d'art. By teaching me to lie about who I was, my dad instilled in me the notion that the differences were actually superficial. They were all just outward trappings, and if you were to change coats with a rich person, then you would immediately be one. In life, there will always be someone trying to take your personhood away. They're trying to get you to think you are less than you are. Happens with color, gender, class, education. There are people who will have you believe that class is genetic and that you are less of a person than them. I was a child of a janitor, but he wanted me to be treated like the child of a professor of philosophy. Lesson 6. Know something about history. My dad was a hoarder. He always came home with objects he had found in the garbage in his pockets. There's a certain relationship that poor people have to their objects and things, a tenderness. Because they have nothing of value, they bequeath a value onto plain objects, and this in turn makes them cherished. It's not the object, but what it symbolizes, what it was supposed to be. Let me elaborate. My dad would give everything he brought home a backstory. According to him, he had traveled all of Europe during the Second World War to get many of the objects in our apartment. There was a dessert spoon he said he had bought from a witch in Bulgaria. There was a tray for cookies that had come from Poland from a woman who had one eye, who wore compression gym socks, and had an adult child who suffered from ulcers and couldn't work, and had to live off of selling magical cookies. He told me he had learned to make pork chops in a 5-star restaurant in Paris. He was a top chef there and would have to make 7 dishes at once. There were escargots climbing all over the walls, and sometimes sad frogs in glass jars. He once set a frog free by flushing it down the toilet and wishing it Godspeed. I never knew whether I believed this or not, and it seemed irrelevant whether it was true. I liked listening to the stories. He never let anything be ordinary. Everything around me, from the doorknob to the lamp, was splendid with meaning and belonged to a museum. And I guess I got a sense of the history of the modern world through these stories, albeit a racist, stereotypical, and ethnocentric one, but still. Once I was walking to school and I passed a quilt in the garbage. When I came home later in that day, the same quilt had been washed and ironed and folded at the foot of my bed. He told me he had paid good money for it at an auction in Old Montreal. I have a shelf with absurd objects that my dad gave me as gifts. My friends will often stop in front of it. They will say something to the nature of, "What the hell is this shelf of worthless, tacky junk?" At which point I will often explain the origins of these articles, how each one was given to me by my father when he would come to visit. Then they will think of them as beautiful. The ceramic goose with a top hat will suddenly seem debonair and begin to tell a tale about its childhood outside Berlin. Lesson number 7. No matter what anyone tells you, crime certainly pays. When he was young, my dad had been a great criminal. He was very proud of these years. Not having pursued a life of crime had been the great regret of his life, I think. He wanted to have been a gangster that Martin Scorsese made movies about. He thought their lives were wonderful. They had escaped their class with a vengeance, exacting a reckoning on everyone who belittled them, and then everyone else just for good measure. What was there not to love? We watched every gangster film many times. My dad believed that breaking the law was, in certain circumstances, not a problem. He definitely had a lax view about stealing because he did it all the time. As a child, I was crazy about cheese. So in the evenings, my father would stop at select grocery stores to steal the most expensive cheese on display. At home, he would arrange them on a plate covered in rabbits that was my favorite. Blue cheese, camembert, gruyere. He would pronounce them in funny ways because he couldn't really read well. He would put them on my lap while we were watching television, and we would eat them with toothpicks with really frilly ribbons on them. We'd watch Benny Hill and turn and nod to each other whenever the mouthful was particularly delightful. I think no one would argue with the idea that if a parent steals food for a child, then they should not be convicted of anything at all. This is a crime driven out of necessity. It's almost a duty to commit such a crime. However, would one argue that it is necessary to steal one's child outrageously expensive cheese when the child has a taste for such? But my father said my taste in cheese shows I was refined. It proved I was descended somehow from French aristocrats. He continued to steal delicacies from the supermarket for me throughout my childhood. "Caviar, milady?" he said one night, pulling a tiny jar from his left pocket. "Ooh," I declared. From out of his other pocket, he pulled a box of tiny marzipan apples. What could I do but applaud and throw my arms around his neck? By the end of his life, we would have to take the city bus a mile before we could go to any grocery store that would let him in. He had been banned from all the ones in the neighborhood. Nobody was going to put you in jail for stealing a fancy imported bottle of olive oil for your child, but they would bar you from ever returning. However, the takeaway from this was that I should not settle with what was offered me in life. I should want more than what my father could afford, and I was expected to find some other methods other than stealing to get them in life. Lesson 8. All sophisticated people have dinner parties. My dad and I like to go to Warshaw's, this great family-run grocery store. They don't really have grocery stores like that anymore. Used to be able to fall in love with the grocery store. In the back, there were always a shelf of random items for sale, tea sets, woks, flower pots, etc., and they were always offered at cutthroat prices. One afternoon, we chanced upon a fondue pot. My dad held it up. This was it. There would be no difference between us and the millionaires now. If we were eating fondue, then we were eating like King Henry VIII. No way around it. He bought the fondue pot, since he couldn't exactly fit it in his pocket. For the next week, my dad began to make preparations for our fondue dinner. He decided to invite all our loved ones over because there's no point in going through the trouble of having a fondue dinner without inviting loads of people to share. My dad hated his biological family with a passion, so none of them were invited. But he called up all his friends. My dad's friends were an eclectic bunch. He had a friend who had robbed a bank and served 11 years in prison, Matthew. Matthew had also promised to take care of his friend's handicapped daughter after he died, and he was true to this commitment. He was very mild-mannered and was always on his way to the grocery store to get some fill up on his Pepsi. He kept to his absurd tasks all day. He taught me about how you can remake your life at any time in life and how true goodness came from unexpected sources. There was a rather bright man named Sylvain who I adored. He was skinny, and he had a lovely way of speaking. He wore a suit and would often have a flower in the boutonniere. He reminded me of people from PBS shows. He would drink and start to laugh and weep. His moods were roller coasters. They were Shakespearean tragedies. His flights of fancy were a primer for understanding Shakespeare and some of the important work I did at McGill. There was a guy named Percival. He used to walk around the city all day to calm his nerves. He walked as though it were a job. Animals liked him, though. He would speak to our toy poodle in such high-pitched voices that it would actually faint from joy. He could whistle like all kinds of birds. Since I lived downtown, I didn't know what any bird other than a pigeon sounded like, but the noises he made were quite beautiful just the same. He was a modern-day Kierkegaard. He really could have written Fear and Trembling on the existential anxiety and the terrifying responsibility of choice. He had another friend who came over who had managed to buy a tiny house for himself years before. It had been declared an eyesore by the city. They'd warned him to clean it up, but he didn't want to. He said he'd worked his whole life, and now it was his prerogative to live in filth. There would be stray cats sitting on the eaves of the house and vines trying to push the windows open like thieves. I think I actually learned nothing from him, but I'm still trying to figure out the lesson. After dinner, they'd go sit on a bench on the corner. Hopefully, there would be a large appliance in the garbage that they could test their respective strength by lifting. I would go with them, and my dad would give me change to go buy a bottle of tonic water to drink. My dad insisted tonic water was only for Friday nights. When I grew up, I was surprised that other people didn't find it was a treat. But there would be no sitting on the bench that evening. My dad somehow thought you could only eat fondue in the dark, as though it were a campfire to scare away minuscule wolves. Because we had to wait until the sun went down, everyone got hungry, and then they started drinking on empty stomachs. And then they started going completely insane. They started feeling sorry for themselves, and when men who are over 50 and have nothing to show for it begin to feel sorry for themselves, mayhem ensues. They all started setting their money on fire. Then they started singing and arm wrestling and falling down the stairs. Sylvain ended up outside, yelling in the middle of the street that no one had ever loved him. "Ignore him," my dad said as I dipped the bread into the cheese. All in all, it was a great night. Everyone had an opportunity to pontificate and articulate their rage and concerns. Everyone had a chance to declare that love was a sham, ex-wives were toasted sarcastically, threats to enemies were made, religion was condemned, universal outrage was the order of the day. It was, in other words, just another night in the court of King Henry VIII. Lesson 9, make yourself a family. This is some more on Matthew. My dad had all sorts of ideas about what family was, and none had to do with biology. A family is a group of trusted associates. More importantly, a family is a group of people who take each other seriously and who are interested in one another's perspectives. My father was always telling me that people were related to me. He would introduce me to someone and give them the title of cousin. The most honored title was uncle. There are no women. Matthew was one of my many uncles. These terms were earned through merit and not blood. One day, Matthew told my father that a young woman had moved in with him. She was very beautiful, he said. She kept him up all night wanting to dance in the kitchen and have drinks. She wore a yellow dress, he said, and he loved it. It spun around when she danced. She insisted he compliment her all day, but despite all the difficulties she brought with her, it was better than living alone. My dad insisted I go over and see what was what. Matthew was, after all, our problem and family. I loved going over to Matthew's apartment anyway. He'd been living in his apartment for so long that the rent was only $200 and some. It still had the furnishings of a 1940s apartment, and there was an air of normality about it. It was decorated during a time before rampant consumerism where everything lost its beauty and meaning days after you bought it. The rooms each had a different color wallpaper that you just didn't see anymore, that depicted exquisite worlds of flowers and delicate birds. There were framed photos of him when he was younger. It was hard to imagine that he lived in a time where everyone was black and white and listened to old-timey music. The only thing that was strange or modern were all the Pepsi bottles. They filled up the backyard. One night when it hailed, the noise of ice pellets on the bottles played Tchaikovsky's Rite of Spring. But only the black cats are able to testify to this. With Milton, the ex-bank robber, we would sit and chop up hot dogs on plates and drink Pepsi in teacups in the shape of open lilies that seemed as though they must close at night and be covered in dewdrops in the morning. There were rooms of the apartment that were closed off to visitors. When I went over to visit that day, he brought me over to the door to the parlor carefully, and he opened it. He pointed to the winged back chair with its blue roses in the middle of the room and introduced me to his new lady friend. I stared at the empty chair for a moment. "Hello," I said. "Oh, she's lovely, isn't she?" Milton exclaimed. She was indeed the most beautiful woman anyone had ever seen. "So, has Uncle Matthew lost his cookies?" my dad asked later. "Yes," I said. "It's all that Pepsi he drinks. I don't know why they don't make that stuff illegal." He put it on the calendar that we should visit Matthew more often. I often felt no one had looked after my dad when he was little or in life, so in some ways, in surprising ways, he had become an odd sort of caregiver to so many. I'm going to do a reality check right now. I feel I need to pause for a moment to interrupt this lecture just in case you're getting the idea that my dad was this wonderful guy. I mean, full disclosure, I have to admit he was an a-hole. There's no way around that. His behavior was always pretty shocking. He was the kind of guy who would be watering the grass, then turn the hose on someone walking by, and then get into a fist fight. My father would always brag about bar fights he'd gotten into as a young man. He once told me that the most underrated weapon in the world is the ketchup bottle because it is inconspicuous in your hand and creates high drama when smashed on a head. In the interest of journalistic integrity, I needed to put that out there. But let's go on. Lesson number 10, it is the thought that counts. My dad always gave me a check for Christmas. They would be for surprisingly large amounts. He once gave me a check for $100. The only thing was that he wouldn't sign them. He said that he didn't have the funds in his account right at the moment, but he would sign it as soon as he did. I collected the checks in a wallet in my underwear drawer, certain that one day I would be quite wealthy as they were really adding up. They represented not what he could give me, but what he wanted to give me. There was always another less spectacular, less assuming gift as well. One year, he bought me a copy of Anne of Green Gables for Christmas. I don't know why he thought I would like it. Maybe a store owner suggested it, or maybe one of his girlfriends. I read it, and I fell madly in love with Anne Shirley. I was angry that the book was over. I was so upset with her. I thought I'd be miserable for the rest of my life now because every girl would fall short compared to Anne Shirley. I didn't like that other people were able to read Anne of Green Gables. None of the other readers loved her the way I did. I wanted what we had to be exclusive. If she was a real person, Anne Shirley would have had to get a restraining order out on me. This might have to do with not having a female figure around. I reread the book almost immediately after finishing it. But I saw on the back of the book that there were other titles in the collection. I asked my dad if he would buy me the next one. It was rather obnoxious because Christmas had just passed, and here I was asking for something else. But to my surprise and delight, my father immediately said yes. We took the bus to the bookstore downtown. We found the books on the shelves, and my dad bought not one, but every title in the series. The storekeeper put all 13 books in a paper bag. I carried them myself in my arms on the way home. I never wanted to be separated from them. This is one of my loveliest memories, but did he really know what he was getting into? He should have known then that there was something wrong with the way I read, the same way you can tell that there's something wrong with the way someone drinks, say. Over the next few years, I began to read in a desperate, wild, brave, obsessive manner. These books gave me everything that was unavailable or inaccessible in my social milieu. People associate reading with doing homework and being good at school, but that's the ordinary kind of reader. That's not the kind of reading I'm talking about. I'm talking about extreme reading, reading stuff that doesn't make sense, the degenerate intellectuals, the off-Broadway playwrights, German post-war melancholia of inherited guilt, Edwardian snobs, treatises written by 1960s homosexuals on their experiences in public toilets. I began writing more and more, too. Since he couldn't curb my journaling, my father thought that at least I might record his advice and pass it on to others afterwards. Perhaps if I were to write a book, it could be called The Pensées of Buddy O'Neill, and that could be the foundation of a universal school of thought like Scientology. But I wanted to have the exquisite joy of writing my own rules, coming up with my own aphorisms and fantastic versions of myself, my own nemesis and absurd idealizations, my own hard-earned truisms and regrets to pass on. My writing began to be its own monster, created from my own experiences and those from the books I was reading. My professors were always surprised because I seemed like a white trash kid destined to work at a Dunkin' Donuts and give birth to juvenile delinquents. But I was reading all the time and thinking about any philosophy I could get my hands on, interpreting texts. And I had been writing for years, developing an odd aesthetic that incorporated my physical and lived childhood with the high art of literary fiction. Some of the things I was going for are as follows: a cross between Marguerite Duras and a used car salesman, a mix of the Satyricon and a McDonald's birthday party, Isabel Archer in a 1970s Las Vegas underage showgirl, Percy Shelley explaining to a court why he can't afford child support. Agatha Christie and the paranoid lady on the ground floor who was involved in everyone's business. Hunter S. Thompson, the little kid on the big wheel who went around and around the block with a big attitude. Samuel Beckett and the couple that fought all the time, threatening to kill each other and then sat down for tea. Jean Reese, if she worked in a peep show booth on Saint Laurent Boulevard, and when you put a coin in the slot and the door opened up, she would sit there naked and frowning and not following any of your instructions. A cross between Antonin Artaud's Theatre of Cruelty and the cast of The Muppet Show. George Bataille and a skipping rope champ. Vladimir Nabokov in the doll section at the Hudson Bay Company. Ralph Ellison and all the lamps my dad took out of the garbage. Words of wisdom from a Bazooka Joe comic and Friedrich Nietzsche. Margaret Atwood and my absent mother. Although I was clearly leaving my dad behind intellectually, it was he who had given me, in part, the confidence to think of my life as being worthy to mix with those of geniuses. So perhaps I will offer you one last piece of advice that my dad taught me. Never, ever, ever watch a Paul Newman film. My dad said he didn't care how many people said Paul Newman was a good actor. This was not the case. My dad talked about Paul Newman as though Paul Newman had stolen his life. My dad had been quite handsome when he was young, but he hadn't been able to trade in on being good looking. My dad said that his salad dressing was the very best in the world. He steamed off the label on the bottle and put in oil and vegetables and spices. He somehow thought of them as being babies that had been switched at birth. The way that my dad talked about Paul Newman made it seem as though they must know each other. Only a long-term grievance could motivate this type of rancor. For a period of my life, I thought Paul Newman was from Montreal, and that he had grown up on St. Urban Street and gone to Baron Byng High School. I always assumed he must have picked on my dad in school or something. I kept expecting Paul Newman to pop up in family photos. I didn't really understand that American movie stars lived in New York or Hollywood. I thought they all just lived downtown near where the Megaplex movie theaters were. Sometimes the doorbell would ring out of the blue and I would get terrified. I would think it was Paul Newman at the door, come to stir things up, come to open old wounds. Or that we might run into Paul Newman at the Canada Day parade, eating red and white cake with a plastic spoon, and all hell would break loose. Whenever I brought up that Paul Newman was a terrible actor, my friends' parents looked at me completely shocked. They had a look on their faces as though they didn't know who I was. But my dad and I held up our ginger ale glasses and clinked them together, not to Paul Newman. There was a repertory cinema near my house. My dad was friends with the guy who ran it, and he would get me tickets. Then one afternoon, when I was 13, I saw the movie The Hustler. There I was in the darkness with Paul Newman. I mean, he was charming and tortured, clever and hapless. How could I not love him? Paul Newman was designed to be loved. Perhaps my father thought if he could keep me away from Paul Newman, he could keep me away from the disappointments of being an adult, the perspective that adulthood usually brings, that you will never achieve all your dreams. You will probably not grow up to be the important person you wanted to be. I didn't tell him that I thought Paul Newman was a wonderful actor. I was the one person in the world who believed that he was better than Paul Newman. I have still, however, never tried his salad dressing out of respect. Sometimes we have nothing to teach. Maybe my dad also thought that if Paul Newman wooed me away, the whole world would woo me away from him too. And what in the world did he have other than me? He had had 3 wives who had all left him. He had other children who never visited. Maybe he thought I would disappear and leave him the way everyone else did. But I didn't. I don't know why, but I always just loved him. I broke all the rules that my dad gave me, but they gave me a context for life. They made life seem exciting. They gave me a sense that everything I did was important, and I carried that notion through my life. When he was dying, a nurse came to our apartment to visit. "I don't think your father is taking any of his pills," he said. "Oh, you're wrong," I said. "Of course he's taking his pills. They get delivered to the door from the pharmacy every week." After the nurse left, I started looking through the doors and cabinets, and behind one cabinet door in the kitchen, I discovered all his pill boxes neatly stacked one on top of the other with their seals unbroken. Like a tiny urban city at dusk. "Dad," I said, "what are all these pills doing here? You're supposed to take them." "Quick," he yelled, putting his arms up in the air so I'd help him out of bed. "Let's get rid of the evidence before the nurse comes back." We dumped them one by one into the toilet. It was like we were in a Martin Scorsese picture and the feds were at the door and we had to dispose of all the bags of cocaine. There was something oddly pleasing about that afternoon. We were back to breaking the law again. We were back to being master criminals. We outwitted everyone else until the very end, and we were gangsters after all. Conclusion. I was happy as a child. Although I liked having a rule book to follow, even though it was absurd, most of my favorite times happened when he wasn't even giving me advice at all. All those wonderful days when we would just totally forget ourselves. We would forget about everything and decide to be the happy losers that we were. We always went to St. Louis Square. There was this one time when my dad bought us both a pile of clothes from a men's clothing store that was going out of business. So picture us both wearing headbands and tweed suits, eating sandwiches like old men. There was something about that park that appealed to both of us. We were always in a good mood when we were in the park. It was like Never Never Land and was filled with drug addicts and bohemians. There were heroin addicts everywhere in the park. They didn't seem alarming to me as a child. That expressions like cartoon characters that had just been hit on the head with a frying pan. They seemed harmless, especially since they did things in slow motion. It would take one an hour to tie a shoe. They'd bend down and just get stuck there. They slept everywhere. They were nappers, so they always reminded me of toddlers who fell asleep regularly at the drop of a hat. My father didn't warn me about doing drugs because it seemed so far to the fabric of our lives that to stay away from junkies was absurd. If we were to cut out people with addictions, then who would we spend time with, and where was the reason in that? Now, St. Louis Square and Prince Arthur were a hubbub of street performers back then, and it was also filled with musicians and clowns. There was a clown I particularly liked who played violin and would stop to wipe the tears off his face with a sponge. Although he didn't warn me about drug addicts, my father did spend plenty of time warning me about clowns. I always thought of clowns as people who agreed with you that every moment of the day was painful if you were in the least bit conscious that you had to carry out the most mundane of tasks, regardless of the fact that the world was filled with tragedy and despair. My father thought they were people who didn't have jobs and who panhandled from children. He would look at the clown, then look at me and say, "Never be an exhibitionist." And now look at me. Once there was a woman who arrived to perform in the path leading up to the flower kiosk, which was a natural performance space. She had black hair that looked as though she'd just woken up, or bedhead as the fashion stylists call it, in a small black cotton dress with a white collar. She looked just like Edith Piaf. She was accompanied by an accordion player. This man was handsome. I wasn't used to accordion players being handsome. I thought of them as old men who spoke other languages and played tunes outside the grocery stores and had small dogs tied to the legs of the kitchen chairs they were sitting on. But he was black and young and fit and wearing a pinstripe suit with brand new shoes. And it was as though they were arguing in the living room of their own house. She would sing a few lines, then would stop to complain to the accordion player that he wasn't getting it right. They would produce the most lovely sounds of music and then stop to squabble. They seemed to be lovers because they exhibited the traits of people who knew each other too well. I wish that they would just accept each other's flaws and play. But who knows? Perhaps it was all part of the act. Maybe the performers had made a deliberate choice to add Beckett-like interruptions to the performance in order to remind us of our imperfections and mortality. In heaven, I'll probably find another version of St. Louis Square, but in that park, the French-Canadian Edith Piaf will finally launch into her song, and the accordion player will no longer be frustrated, and they will play the tune that immortal people with no worries play. And in that park, my father will be sitting on a bench waiting for me with a pin out, ready to sign all the Christmas checks.
Thank you so much for your fantastic talk and for sharing that with us all. I find myself thinking about, you mentioned early on, you were talking about your father's stories and their relationship to truth. I know the conversation today, you're invited to reflect in this talk, thinking about truth and the relationship between fiction and nonfiction. I wonder what you think, how you think about truth in your own writing and how that relates to to everything you shared with us today.
Yeah, I mean, I think fiction is these unusual ways at capturing different truths. And I think when we speak to each other and tell anecdotes, we always kind of invent them. I mean, we're just natural storytellers as human beings in the way we kind of, when we talk to our children, we relay them back anecdotes from our lives, but we switch them and edit them in order for us to present our personas to our children. And I think as writers, you're just always kind of taking the real world and editing it and just kind of mastering it to get at different types of truth.
Could you talk a little bit about your writing process from the initial concept, I guess, to the finished story? How much do you know before you start writing? Do you map it all out, or do you just kind of get an idea and go with it?
I'll have my idea. Often for a novel, I often start with my characters. They're the first thing that I come up with. But I always just take tons and tons of notes and make kind of little drafts, like little sketches of what the novel will be like to try and figure out what I want the voice to be and different, and to see what works on the page, because sometimes something's in my head, but it doesn't quite work on the page. It just doesn't want to live there. And then sometimes I'll start writing an idea, and then it's just been in my brain and wants to escape, and it lives almost on its own at the end of the pen. So my process is just I usually write tons of notes, and then I look at the notes, and then from there I construct a story, and then I write the story. When I finished university, I first started writing poetry. So a lot of the first stuff that I wrote was poems, and that was kind of how I began to develop my voice, which is probably why my writing is so imagistic. Then I went from poetry to working on lullabies for little criminals. So there was not really like a large period of time that I wrote short stories. Then I wrote, while I was writing The Girl with Saturday Night, I wrote a lot of short stories that became the short story collection. But I suppose I think of myself more as a novelist. Like the book that I just wrote, actually, the first inklings of it, when I was 22, I had this idea for writing a novel about gangsters in the 30s, because I had always liked the stories that my dad had told me from then. I had actually some of the characters already from the Lonely Hearts Hotel in my head, and I sat down, I wrote it. The novel, I just spent all night, and it was like 4.5 pages when I was done. And I was like, that's not a novel. Like I photocopied it and like stapled it and handed it out to my friends. Actually, it was called The Romeo Hotel, and it was just about these like love-struck gangsters who just kind of hung around this hotel. And I got that from, I was listening to a Bob Dylan song. That's how oddly enough, The Lonely Hearts Hotel, in part comes from a Bob Dylan song, and he was singing about these people who were hanging out at the Romeo Hotel. So I was like, oh, I'm going to write a book called The Romeo Hotel with gangsters in it. So then I decided to revisit it, knowing now how to write a novel. So I had those characters. And then I actually looked up the Bob Dylan line, and he sings, they're all hanging out around the old hotel. So I was like, oh my God, this whole novel came from hearing a word. One of the amazing things about novels is they're so imperfect, which allows for all sorts of different readings of them, and kind of reveals things that the novelist didn't want to reveal, and it's just like messy closets. My method now is when I think it's like 85% done, then I just let it go out of my hands. I'll never get to 100% because I used to try, and then it's just like, you just can never get there.
Can I ask you about clowns? In the Lonely Hearts Hotel, your clowns are also sad and funny. You suggested at the end of your talk that there's a relationship between clowns and writers, and I wonder if I can maybe impose upon you to talk a little bit more about that.
Did I say that at the end? I suppose. I was fascinated by clowns because they seem to be articulating just these minor actions, but then imparting all the gravitas of the human existence into it. It just kind of bespoke to me like the amount of meaning that can be in everything. The book is about sadness and melancholia, so, and sort of most tragic orphans of all time. Yeah, it's just populated by clowns who are able, because they, of course, are the artists of sadness and interpreting it. So, I mean, Rose and Piero are in part clowns, and the book is kind of based a bit on Commedia dell'arte, with the Italian Renaissance theater with all the clowns. In the same way that kind of in The Girl with Saturday Night, like alley cats are a sort of Greek chorus that comment on everything that's happening in the novel. In this book, there are these very depressed, alcoholic, drug-addicted clowns who will give that kind of Shakespearean analysis of what's happening.
I live in the plateau. From my accent, you will see that I'm a French Canadian. I often see that there's a divide in Montreal between the east and west of St. Lawrence Street. I haven't read your book, but have you talked about or this divide that is in Montreal, or will you eventually write about it?
Yeah, I wrote a ton about it in my second book,
Okay.
The Girl with Saturday Night. So you may. So yes, I have. I mean, I always live I live right in Saint Laurent, which is in the middle. So it's always kind of interesting. So I always kind of play on that tightrope between the two sides of the city.
How has Montreal shaped your writing?
I think wherever I grew up probably would have had a big influence because I'm sort of really interested in place, just like physical details, so that inevitably would have shaped the character. But definitely that sort of romantic, bohemian, sort of rose-colored way of Saint Laurent Boulevard, where I spent so much of my life, and Leonard Cohen and Mordecai Richler and their sort of and Mavis Gallant and the sort of oddball characterization of Montreal totally influenced my sense of identity and the style that I write in, I think. I mean, definitely, I'd still be a writer probably anywhere else. Or maybe not. Maybe if I had a functional childhood, I'd be doing something more productive.
I'm thinking of the image of the small pillbox city at dusk, in the back of a drawer, and the relationship there between the shelf of knickknacks that your dad storied to you, how you think the relationship between these little images and kinship, so your dad and his friends and your uncles and cousins sharing with you these little things that they find in the garbage, and then you sharing those little pieces of garbage with us. And how you think about kinship and family and politics with all its fucked upness in that way.
I think, in a way, those objects and the sort of the weight of meaning on each one has influenced the way that I write about details, and how in my books the details are very important and constructed in a way that each one kind of exists. I always wanted, when I started writing each poem, to kind of be a haiku that could exist on its own and sort of tell its own tale. And I think it resembles, in a way, the oddball little items that people had. And I mean, what they were doing is totally literary. When you take an object and imbue it with emotional significance that's so particular to the holder of the object and not necessarily the object itself. So much of my writing is about that, and layering metaphors, which kind of, I mean, metaphors always give multiple meanings to an object and give them completely unexpected ones that open it up. So
I really enjoyed the Girl It Was Saturday Night. I was drawn to that by the sort of central story of the father, the famous pop singer, and his children who were sort of carried along in his career, although they were now poor and sort of had not benefited from it at all, and yet it was coming back to kind of haunt them. When you were mentioning the Paul Newman as the kind of alternative father, and also about performance, it seems like a theme that maybe comes up a lot in this idea of sort of a celebrity self that exists alongside, or with the sort of normal everyday, the kind of the failure or success, or something about how those things go together in your work. And I'm kind of curious about it. The manufactured self in the film of the children, and then their real lives, and how that worked in your life, or if you were resolving something of your father, maybe not becoming that artist he wanted to be, or?
Well, I think definitely with with Etienne, the father, in The Girl with Saturday Night, because he is like a chansonnière, was a tradition where you were a folk singer, but you couldn't actually. I mean, it was better. The public liked you more if you couldn't actually sing. So he's this musician who's incredibly famous but has no talent. His entire career basically is built on a grandiose persona. And yeah, so I was interested, because I'm just interested in the idea of persona and who we imagine ourselves to be and how little it has to do sometimes with who we actually are. I was kind of interested in like famous personas because a lot of times we kind of see them not as people, but as roles that we can possibly play. And we kind of get these skewered ideas of celebrityhood because they're presenting, you know, as if it, like Commedia dell'arte, it's like, which role would you like to play? And I was like, well, I think like Paul Newman is actually the role I was meant to play.
It says here on the program, the last sentence says, and how I had to teach myself everything in order to cross the class divide. And considering everything you just told us, I'm just curious how you had also mentioned that you were studying at McGill at one point, and now you're here, obviously, and we all are really interested in you. But how did you cross that class divide, and was there more to it than your dad helping you be perceived or treated as the professor of philosophy's daughter? How did you teach yourself everything from the point that you left your dad to sitting on this stage now, I guess?
I think it was actually like a consciousness. I think when I was about 20, like I did all these things that were, I guess I was bright for the environment that I was growing up in, and I was good at school, and basically I was good at reading. And it became kind of like the blessing that allowed me to just sort of know about different things in the world. But at the same time, by the time I turned 20, I just realized I had all these behavioral problems that were just, and I was doing things that were putting me on the path to like being another lower class. Like I already had a baby at that age, and it was just like hanging out with unsavory people. And then I just remember turning 21, and I was like, I just have to be very conscious of my choices from now on, because I've just, I'm going down this negative, bad road. So I just started working really hard. Like I turned 21 and I was like, that's it. I'm going to like pursue my dreams, and it has to be sort of a full-on activity. And then at that point, I really started having to figure out the world all by myself. Because a lot of things my dad couldn't help me with, like he had no idea like how one applies to university or anything like that. So I just became like struggling. I think I just like struggled really hard for 5 years. I just remember just being like hellish.
What's your favorite guilty pleasure leisure activity?
I have 2 dogs, and like it's funny because my dogs are so neurotic, and I know it's my fault because your dogs take on your personality. So whenever they're being completely crazy, like I can't totally be angry with them. I know it's because they live with me, and they've picked up on this idea that we're just anxious all day. And we sit on the couch and we're just like anxious together. Sometimes I like to decorate my house, and I'm sort of like, because having grown up with a dad who's a janitor, I'm really good at like fixtures. So I like do Invisible Man stuff. I don't know. I don't really do anything other than write.
How does your upbringing inform the way you're raising your daughter?
Well, she's raised now. It's done. I don't know. I think I was starting from scratch with her. I was kind of like a irresponsible, like single mom. I actually remember at the time, like I really liked reading books from the late 60s by people like Nell Dunn, because they described young motherhood and being like a flaky mom at 21, because I just couldn't find it in contemporary literature. It was much different. She had a much, much different childhood than me. Like she always reads my books, and she's like, why so sad? And one, she was like, why couldn't it just end like happier? And then I was like, well, That's because we had different childhoods, and my perspective on life is just bleak, and that's your instinct for it to be a happy ending is because you had a much happier childhood. So we just kind of spent her childhood like going to see clowns and stuff. We had this commitment one year where I was like, we're going to see every single clown show that tours through Montreal, and we'll become these great clown experts. So we saw all the clowns, and we became really obsessed with them. And you forget sometimes when you have an obsession, you assume everybody else does. And there was this one clown who was coming from Paris, and in the billing it said he was able to play like a violin that was 5 inches, and we were like, this is phenomenal. This is like the greatest thing ever. So we marked on the calendar the day that the tickets went on sale at 10 o'clock in the morning, but we're both great sleepers. So we woke up at 1 and we're like, oh my God, the tickets. And it was pouring rain, so we ran to St. Denis Theater, and we got to the kiosk, and we're like, okay, which tickets are left? And the guy was like, dude, all of them. That anecdote just kind of encompasses the way I raised my kid.
In your CBC interview, you said you write 2 books at once and bounce back and forth, board of one. How many hours a day do you write, and how long does it take you to write a book?
It totally depends. Also, I don't have enough of a sample group to tell you. Saturday night, it seems like you can calculate because it came out, I guess, was it 7.5 years or 8 years? I have anxiety because I'm like, it's 7.5 years, not 8.
7 years and 5 months. No.
I think you're right. It was 7 years and 5 months. No, yeah, I don't know. What does it matter? But I wrote that and the short story collection at once and at the same time, and I had the beginning of the Lonely Hearts Hotel, because it used to take me incredibly long, but I started this method of juggling books, which has been working for me, and basically I work on at least 2 at the same time, because I get to a point where I hate what I'm writing so much that I have to that I just throw it aside. Then I go back to the old one, and it's like returning to an ex-boyfriend, and you're like, oh my God, I forgot all the good things about you. And then you get engaged with them again, and then 3 or 4 months later, you're like, I remember why I called it off. Screw this. And then I go back to the other one. I'm like, hey, I'm sorry. I won't leave you again. And somehow that process works, and so that's speeded up my process, and I found a groove that way.
All right, I think that answer lets us know that we can expect more fantastic works to come from Heather O'Neill in years upcoming. Heather, you've been extremely generous and kind with us this evening, and I hope we can give Heather O'Neill another big round of applause.